At the end of May 2025, it has been rude far and wide that international law seems bankrupt due to its inadequacy in addressing the situation in Gaza. Seattle academics and Pittsburgh academics had settled long ago on their justification for how I was deliberately mauled and put in a secret prison of panopticon guerrilla theater observation. The heroes of that story from long ago are Yusu N'Dour and Peter Gabriel, who rejected me as a symbol of American presumption and the stereotype of a weak and ineffectual liberal crying because his girlfriend rejected him. And if you're to believe them, there is no continuity between that stunt they pulled and the absence of international law. Because surely the great progressives of prog rock music in Britain do not argue that international law itself is weak and ineffectual liberalism that should be rejected as unromantic. Or is that what they are doing? Is their patron saint John Lennon actually the spirit of the abolition of international law? And if John Lennon is actually the spirit of the abolition of international law, don't the young and healthy owe their loyalties to the spirit of the abolition of international law? I think we can reasonably conclude, despite the fact that they sealed their tongues rather than be heard in their duplicities, that they are not arguing that they are the spirit of the abolition of international law. Rather, they are arguing that jealous boyfriends are oppressors of women, and they represent the liberation of women. So let's examine their guerrilla theater war game. They had a faculty member from the English department, born in India, seduce me as a journalist for this campus student newspaper. And this symbolized the white ineffectual crossing the Louis line. So Yusu N'Dour came yammering in the name of John Lennon that Maduri Goto had selected the glamorous black cosmonaut Barack Obama to symbolize the tribute of Jeff Corporation homosexuals to the glamour and liberation of women from oppressive, weak, and liberal, ineffectual white males. And we know how persuasive all that was, because it rules the airwaves with the idea that I was so weak and ineffectual of a deaf, self-inflicted crybaby liberal American symbol of sheltered presumption and pretense that I was actually to blame for the murder of John Lennon. And having extrapolated all of this to such a story and the media accepted with stony silence, without any peer review or checks or balances or evidence that might bring to light where this idea originates. We conclude that I am the person who is in opposition to international law. After all, I also symbolize the U.S. San Jacinto, and Putin has announced that America should be sanctioned for using the atomic bomb. So I'm a symbol of the survival of the Navy due to the atomic bomb. So Yoko Ono has good cause in claiming that her alliance with the Zionists who wrote the script, Gail Burston, and the Zionists who performed the story of the script, Leslie Katz and John Schulman, despite their frenzied culture's murderous destruction of Gaza. In fact, if you in any way believe that I was sincere in advocating for the poor people of Gaza, then you too symbolize the destruction of international law. It is therefore not the Israelis, as shown by Yusuf N'Dour's reasoning, but the Palestinians who stand in opposition to international law. And of course, the Palestinians say no. We have nothing to do with the bombing of Hiroshima. We have been destroyed like Hiroshima. They're coached to say by the Japanese. So bombing Hiroshima was in fact an outgrowth of weak and ineffectual liberalism who crybabied over rejection by a Zionist girlfriend. So let's be clear that this is the story that is told by the Lenin functionaries. So we know where it all leads. Hiroshima, Leslie Katz and Gail Burston in Palestine are all the victims of a metaphor for weak and ineffectual liberalism. Now suppose, in contrast to this story that is accepted and performed by the Beatles and their entourage over and over again with the help of the Green Party, Seattle, and Pittsburgh. I make clear the issues that I have struggled for as a deaf man trying to get an education. Sustainable development goals, ecology, the civil rights movement, sanctuary for refugees caused by immoral Western NATO wars, and the poor people of Gaza. So there is controversy as to whether or not my personal behavior bears that out. Lynn Atkins of Bethany College once said that my values are better than my behavior. So they have built a behavioral. And the behavioral is one that alleges that sticking to the facts is in fact immoral. The facts are that I may have been an undesirable boyfriend, but I didn't in any way contradict the right of women to leave me and reject me. I simply dealt with it in an emotionally disruptive way. I was a little bit emotionally disruptive. I cried. And one of the reasons why I cried was that I had an implanted neuroplasm that the people setting this up knew all about. So we start to wonder now if it's only a half truth that Peter Gabriel and Youssou N'Dour is selling. Are they actually in concert with international law? And to understand that, you have to see what legal system they actually do stand for and how it contrasts with international law. The system that they stand for is the morality of one man, one woman, like one man, one vote. One man, one woman, one man, with, of course, the great chain of being tracing back to the Adam and Eve of East-West Circuit Golf Course, who were John and Yoko. And being Irish, I was grandstanding as a usurper by talking about making a public statement with Maduri Gota. So we know that Gail Burson's understanding of how these courtship rituals operated was actually promoting the British cause. So when Paul McCartney sided with the scriptwriters who they claim killed John Lennon, he was doing so in the British cause. Hence, he was on the same soccer court with new teammates. This syndicate is Islamo-fascist, Zionist Christian messianism of the sort of Ronald Reagan. And we have Oliver Stone, Ringo Starr, and the Sandbagger Alliance of alternative media saying that Reagan stood up for the Lennons, and Jeffin himself and George Takei himself are both gay men. How can they not have been standing up for gay psychology? So Ronald Reagan was a religious fundamentalist. He was responsible for Bork. He was an apocalyptarian Christian Armageddonist. And he was from Hollywood. And Hollywood never lies. If you don't believe me that Hollywood never lies, why don't you just go ask Spike Oldley? Yes, Spike Oldley. So we know that Lenin stood for religious extremism. Ronald Reagan met with the Ayatollah Khomeini, and so did Michael Foucault. In secret, they had an alliance that was known as the Iran-Contra Triangle, where Zionists worked military missions for Iran at the behest of Oliver North. We also know that Hamas met with Egypt and representatives for Donald Trump after the Muslim Brotherhood ousted Hosni Mubarak from Egypt. So we know that Hamas and the Ayatollah Khomeini had some secret diplomacy going with Reagan and Trump and Oliver North. One of the people who was an apostle of this sort of fundamentalist tripartite system was Robert Fripp of King Crimson, the guitarist who positioned Youssou N'Dour. In multipolar politics, as the Russian Orthodoxy regards the situation in the world at large, there have to be certain agreements for courtesy of diplomatic relations between the participant members. And what we're seeing is that the Leninist state is actually objecting to the international law framework, which allows, for example, women legally to commit adultery without punishment. That's one of the liberation of women phenomenon that the Islamofascist Zionist Christian militias disapprove of. And the way that they go about disapproving of it is by, of course, blaming the male who was participating. So you have a situation that was set up to use John Lennon for the subversion of international law while claiming it was, in fact, the demolition of white American insipid, weak-kneed, crybaby liberalism. So we know that international law must side with the people who are stomping on Gaza, because if they were not to side with the people who were stomping on Gaza, they would have to abandon their claim that John Lennon is their patron saint. Now, the idea that John Lennon is the patron saint of the religious extremists is built into a martyrdom complex that was created around images in suasion media. People follow those who lead them into battle in the traditional societies of Christian Knights of Resignation and bizarre, bloated voodoo stories like Nosferatu's Amalek, as well as, of course, the tales of ISIS warriors. So the clamoring in Africa for martial fulfillment of their destiny plays hot-headed, saber-rattling iconography of a role in Planet Hollywood's production system of this fundamentalist tripartite system that argues that two virgins pussy ball or martial marital fidelity is the unifying factor that is transcultural to the human race. All men feel violated if their wife cuckolds them or their girlfriend cheats on them. And so the law should enforce strictly marital fidelity unless the boy who has been cuckolded is a crybaby about it. And then they see things much, much differently. So if you look at the situation with international law being enforced by multipolar national cultures, what you have to accept is that romance and growing up is sometimes a little bit messy. And sometimes women are fickle because they don't understand all of the world's complexities. People fall in love and fall out of love. And it's important to get a grip about these characteristics of the phony baloney that's being promoted by people who wrote a script which no one is discussing. The reason they are not discussing it is in their mythology that I, who they call queerball or queerbait, or the anti-Lennon, would think I was God if somebody said he was used in a script about the murder of John Lennon. And to avoid this phony baloney business of me thinking I'm God, which is absurd, and I should never have been used for such an absurd theater production system. They say that they will side with the people who wrote the script, and there will be a blackout. And strangely, I find myself arguing with a total blackout. It's not a strange situation to be in. Well, the truth of the matter is that the reason for the blackout is not what they claim. It's not because I would think I was God. It was because they would discover, the public would have to review, that the script originates among people who were working with Lenin from long before he pulled his what class? His Houdini. That's right. And this setup was sort of a mockery of a concert for Bangladesh. They used genocide porno to raise money for the victims of the AIDS attack. And the supernova was a symbol of this. The supernova, like Arab Spring, were the promise of celebration of the human rights movement internationally. Arab Spring was doomed to be crushed out in Gaza by Sisi, Toon, Nosferatu, and the people who Foucault held court with in Iran before the Iran-Contra Triangle. And Youssou N'Dour is their bagpipe